Hello, Dr. Seemiller. Thank you so much for joining us today. My first question to kind of kick off this discussion is, what is student leadership?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate it. And I love being able to talk with student leaders such as yourselves, right? Because, certainly I can answer this question and you can answer this question. It's probably pretty similar to each other, really. It's, with student leadership, it's this idea of being able to do two things. One is learn about or develop the skills, develop your capacity to engage in leadership. And secondly, is to potentially participate in a role that allows you to do that. So when you're an elected or a selected position, you get a chance to practice being a leader. But I think it's, first and foremost, the most important part about it is learning how to engage in effective leadership. I always think of this story when someone says, well, I became president of my organization and therefore I'm a leader. And I think, you are in a leadership role, but do you really know how to engage effectively in leadership? Do you know how to pull the members together? Do you know how to motivate them? Do you know how to lead meetings? Do you know how to, hold people accountable? Do you know how to deal with conflict? I mean, or are you just assuming that you know how to do those things by virtue of the fact that you just got elected? I will often talk about learning how to swim, right? If you take someone who doesn't know how to swim and you throw them into the pool, are they a swimmer? Well, they probably are trying to doggy paddle and not drown, right? And maybe they have some skills that are effective, right? A stroke or something that keeps them above water. But the art of swimming is actually, there's techniques, there's skills, there's practice. And that's exactly the same thing with leadership. So you have to have, the skills and the foundations to be able to do it before just jumping into a position and assuming, hey, I can do it because I was elected or selected or in this role.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I guess maybe to follow up in terms of the academic research on student leadership, what are some of the key theoretical trends that you maybe observed or that are currently prevalent in student leadership research right now?
Well, I think there's a couple things that are really important to know about leadership is the difference between leader and leadership, right? This idea that somehow there's this one person that is supposedly in charge and that everyone else kind of follows them or is motivated and inspired solely by this one person's presence. We're moving really away from that. And while people are in positions and they do have to take initiative and step up and be in charge of different aspects, maybe of an organization or an experience, at the end of the day, leadership really, and with what we're looking at from a research perspective, leadership is really process oriented. It's the idea that leadership happens when people take initiative to do good things, create change, move forward, and oftentimes involves more than just one person. So you can engage in self-leadership, certainly. You can engage in something that models that behavior and does, those things, but at the same time, leadership is really kind of the magic that happens in the room, right? When the group is there. Imagine like a meeting that you've had, right? And there's 10 people at this meeting and you have an amazing conversation about something, come up with a great solution to a problem you've been facing. Think about how that would have been totally different had maybe a different person been there, maybe a different person that wasn't at the original meeting, or a person who was at the meeting who say they weren't at that meeting. The leadership is the process. It's that magic that happens. And so when we think about leadership, we have to sort of move away from the fact that leadership is just one person. But leadership is really something that happens with kind of a lot of people working synergistically together. That's certainly one kind of theoretical perspective. The other big question is leadership for what, right? What does it mean, right? So why would you, or you're, for instance, a student leader. You're in some type of a role, a formal position in your organization, and therefore you have specific duties assigned to that role. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could answer leadership for what? Yeah, leadership for what? I'm the secretary or, of this organization. I'm taking notes or doing whatever I'm doing. Yes, you have duties, but at the, really kind of at the end of the day, what is the whole purpose of the organization? Right? What is the organization doing to move forward? What is the organization doing to contribute? And how are you in that role helping move that organization forward? So it's bigger than just what are my roles and duties. It's like, what are we even here for, right? Is the purpose of our organization to create change in the community? Is the purpose of our organization to bring awareness to others? What is the whole leadership for what? So if we start looking at that at a bigger level, then we think about everybody plays a really important role in that. And in order to move that organization or the initiative or whatever you're doing or the cause forward is really this kind of group synergy that happens.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Maybe just to follow up, in terms of differentiating maybe student leadership from other types of education leadership, it seems that I guess from a practical, from our experience as student leaders, it seems there's a challenge between, I guess, balancing the developmental education aspects of student leadership. So student leadership designed to prepare students for future leadership roles after graduation, and I guess the real political aspects, especially in terms of education micropolitics, where students are just directly engaged in that real decision making that could happen, or at least have the potential to take part in that. So I guess, for example, when those of us at IAPSS, we send delegations to, political science association conferences, or for instance, the UNESCO consultative status group to advise on education policy and stuff. There's sometimes a stigma in terms of student organization. They see that and it's almost, okay, you're a leader in training as opposed to a real leader. And I guess sometimes in some of the literature, there seems to be a lot of prevalence of the developmental education aspects. There is some new stuff about that's more kind of real politics oriented, but yeah, I guess in terms of the current state of the literature on student leadership and maybe where you would like to see it go in the future, what are your thoughts, or maybe about this developmental education, real politics dichotomy here?
Well, I mean, I think that that's something important as you talk about those both coexisting. I don't land on either side. I think they could both happen simultaneously, because I think in any situation where you're in kind of a quote in training process, you're still doing whatever that work is. So I mean, take any profession, even when you're in the profession and you're somehow, kind of a junior level employee or whatever you are kind of in training, you're still doing the work. And so trying to pull those out and looking at them in like a student leadership context, you're right, is kind of muddy and very confusing. It's this idea, should we be training leaders, or should we just be like giving them space to be leaders? So they are leaders now, but are they not really leaders? And the answer is yes, and right. I mean, everybody's always in a training situation where hopefully all of life is developmental. And so our job in higher education is to help you, you as students develop the skills that you need to be able to lead effectively now and in the future. And that's the important thing is, and the part of the now is saying, hey, I'm going to be here with you so that if it doesn't go the way that you hope, because maybe it's just the first time you've ever dealt with something, I'm here to help you process through that. I'm here to help you develop those skills. But at the same time, I'm also going to support you and put you, in situations where you're leading. And it's just that there's high stakes, real life leadership that's happening. And I think that that's important, and they have to exist together. I would imagine that even in the role that I'm in as professor, I came in as a junior professor, sort of like a professor in training of sorts, if you were to think about it. But at the same time, I was still teaching classes. So they expected me to still step up and perform. It's just that I was learning new things along the way about how to be a better teacher. And I always am. So if we think of ourselves as always a work in progress, then that is, kind of a good, healthy way of seeing, kind of how we show up. Now, the question is on the other side that I think is important, where you say that people who aren't necessarily or don't work with students specifically see a kind of a student group come in and they're giving advice and they're, providing advisor capacity. And it's like, well, they're not real leaders. That stigma is a little bit harder to get around because, there's their own experience and their own perception of what constitutes, kind of a legitimate leader. But that's pretty much in some ways on them and their perception. I mean, that can be changed. Certainly the more, students show up in these leadership roles and these leadership experiences and say things and do things that are well-informed and, kind of, contributing to the situation, the more and more other people will say, wow, these students have a lot to say and a lot to do. And a lot of the change that's happening, is coming from their initiatives. So part of that stigma is broken by the fact that, students like you all just keep stepping up and keep doing this work. And at some point, other people are going to say, great, they're doing this work and they are leaders. They're just younger leaders and have a different perspective, than maybe I do.
Yeah, and I think going along that vein of thought as well, a lot of the global leadership movements that we've seen developed over the past few years have recently seen a decline in either membership or support. But over the pandemic, a lot of organizations within the United States and abroad have been trying to start up once again, including like political science associations, student associations within the United States, and some other countries. So I guess like that begs the question that I want to pose to you as to where you think the trajectory of global student leadership is going in the next few years, and what people who are not probably in the community can do to help bolster that trajectory to a more positive outlook.
Yeah, this is great. This is really the area that I study. I look at a lot of things with younger people, particularly Generation Z. And so this is the work that I do, and I love looking at the data on social movements, social change, those kinds of things. So when we look at ways in which I'm going to say kind of students looking at more kind of traditional age students, like I said, I study the population from like 18 to 26. And so looking at that kind of that age group, you know, the things that we're seeing as leadership aren't necessarily things that maybe older generations thought leadership was, right? This formal organizational membership, the very methodical step-by-step process of how to advocate for change and doing it in ways that are very familiar. You know, younger folks are doing leadership in different ways, particularly, you know, virally. This idea of, you know, part of leadership is this idea of coming together for something you believe in. And until we had social media and technology, that was really, really difficult. And now, you know, with the ability to be able to connect, you know, all of a sudden, boom, you've got Instagram, you got 100,000 followers on there, or, you know, and you're able to just get something out and say, hey, we're going to coordinate a climate walkout on Tuesday. And all of a sudden, everybody around the world knows it and can do it. You're talking about putting a sense of empowerment into the hands of people that they never had before. And that's something that I think, you know, younger generations are appreciating the ability to do that more and are being able to mobilize much more quickly. So not using the standard operating procedure that older people say, well, create an NGO or have a 501c3 organization, raise money, fight for a cause. It's not like that. It's like, there's a lot of other ways in which leadership can happen. I mean, significant ways too around things like, you know, boycotting, you know, different companies. Like, you know, we're seeing major movements where it's like virally spread through, young people saying, don't shop here. All of a sudden, boom, that is leadership. That's happening really fast. And again, outside of the realm of what we're used to seeing on such a global level. So I think we're going to see more and more leadership, particularly from younger folks. But I also think we're going to be seeing more diversified methods of that leadership, meaning it's not going to all be the way that, you know, we've seen it in the past. It's going to be definitely kind of grassroots, but it's going to be viral. It's going to be globally coordinated. It has been globally coordinated. It's not, nothing can take place in isolation anymore. It's not like, I mean, even with things like you look at like Black Lives Matter, and we had protests in the United States last summer, right? Or, you know, a year and a half ago, there were Black Lives Matter protests all around the world that were happening in solidarity, even in countries where this was not the same kind of an issue because of the viral nature of being able to get out the word. And so we're starting to see, again, this kind of global camaraderie, even on issues that aren't necessarily facing particular people in particular countries. So I see that we're going to have more and more of that. And the pandemic has allowed people to become even more in tune with being able to be coordinated, even if you don't meet and do like an actual march, or you don't meet and you're not out like face to face. This global coordination is just kind of an unbelievable tactic. It's just going to get even more so.
Yeah, we're definitely optimistic about that as well. And I guess in addition, we've kind of noticed at the same time there have been some policies passed around the world in recent years that have maybe, while these kind of viral communication technology advancements have been helping, the more traditional forms of student democracy have actually been under threat in many cases. We were talking with, I guess, one of the last vice presidents of the United States Student Association, so the national student government in the US for post-secondary students, which collapsed around 2018. And they were saying that there were a lot of policies passed and maybe some court decisions that made student government membership voluntary instead of like an automatic thing, right? So this allowed students to sort of opt out, which really made it very much seem less of a government and more like just like an extracurricular group, right? So it really negatively impacted the representation aspect to the point where there is no national representation body in the US, at least for all of the subjects of study. So yeah, we're definitely trying to help revitalize that. But at the same time, similar policies have been passed in Australia, New Zealand, in Sweden, right? And even to a larger extent, even with all this communication technology that should be fostering a lot of cross-border communication, what we've been seeing is actually a bit counterintuitive in that there's been a larger decline and collapse of student government, student democracy, student unions around the world. So we've seen even with the Hong Kong case where the government of China just kind of came in and kind of took things over. So in a sense, they really quashed a lot of the student protests that were happening. We're still in the similar situation that happened in Belarus, where our political science student counterparts there were telling us about, yeah, a lot of violence that they were being met with. But you know, you'd think there'd be a lot of alliance building, a lot of maybe a global chain of resources among student governments to help out with that situation. But yeah, it's actually been a lot of collapse, a lot of decline. We have, you know, bans on student organizing in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge. And I guess the crowning aspect of that would be the collapse of the International Union of Students. So we used to have a global student representative body that existed since the 1940s, but in the 2000s it collapsed as well. So that's kind of the challenges that we're facing right now. We're trying to work with other organizations to try to rebuild those student governments around the world and try to make a global one for all the subjects of study as well. But yeah, I guess in terms of this practical organizing and trying to make sure that we have a formal spot at the decision-making table, because like the movements on their own are nice. They're definitely a part of our activism strategy, but on their own, we're kind of on the outside looking in when we're just protesting, right? In many cases, it's almost a last resort. I think Philip Altbach's research on student movements in the 1980s, he pointed out that yeah, there's definitely risks of violence to it. There's challenges in terms of the leadership structure of the student movement, where it might be led by a small group of folks and it might not really be the collective will of everybody else. And it might be, there might be kind of barriers in terms of students being the leaders of the movement in terms of their social class, other identity factors that might play into that in terms of the societal forms of discrimination. So I guess in terms of trying to rebuild or just build from scratch these networks and stuff, are there any insights that you would like to share with you know, student leaders, be they political science students, or I guess our allied organizations and other subjects, or in various countries, continents around the world?
Yeah, I mean, what you're sharing is really, you know, really interesting, and looking at the demise of the formal structures at which other people can disassemble. You know, one of the things that we do know about student leadership is that students are going to organize, students are going to come together, and students are going to basically form whatever kinds of groups and coalitions, regardless of kind of formal status. And while yes, it is outside looking in, it's going to be kind of like, you know, a dog chasing its tail in some ways, where, you know, you may find one way to create something else, and then, you know, again, that gets sort of disentangled, and, you know, whatever that comes undermines, and then you create something else. And so it's going to be a matter of perseverance in one hand, and another element of cleverness, right? Finding ways to work around some systems that can't be disassembled quite as easily as maybe others could. Does that mean, like what you're talking about, working through other types of organizations that might non-traditionally be or be unrelated whatsoever to advocacy and governance, right? I mean, literally working through the Spanish Club. I mean, you know, like on a campus, like pulling together clubs and organizations that are relatively unrelated and saying, let's work together in unity. I mean, you have to get to a point where no clubs and organizations could exist. And, you know, so I have great faith that young people like yourselves are going to find creative ways to work around the system. And I think that's the part that's going to be huge, is as the system continues to, and I would say break down sounds a little too passive, it's much more active. There are active players involved in undermining some of these things. But as these things happen, I don't believe that the best course of action is to continue to try to fight a system exclusively, right? You definitely want to be putting your resources there a little bit to sort of challenge that system. But where the answer, I believe, lies, and I don't know what the answer is, but where it lies is working around the system to find other ways of being able to organize, legitimize, and find ways to connect. So, and I don't, like I said, I don't know what that looks like, but I have complete faith in the idea that there are many solutions out there that are not going to be the traditional path. So part of the resources might be trying, restoring some of these organizations and, being able to help overturn some of these policies that are undermining democracy. And that's all very important. But there's going to be some other creative ways that I think that you all are going to be able to come across that are going to really, really charge up your ability to have more empowerment than maybe you would think. And so I'd say put your heads together and start thinking about ways to work around a system. You're not going to be able to break the system. It's been in place for a long time. There's a lot of power behind it. And you can certainly, like I said, challenge it. And I'm not discouraging you from trying to do so, but I'm saying you're going to be able to work right around some of these things so easily. And like I said, a dog chasing its tail, you're going to be building something up. And then all of a sudden the powers that be are going to come in and say, wait a minute, hold on. They got their power back. They got, they're finding ways to organize and do all this stuff and come, and then you're already on to your next endeavor. And unfortunately, that's not the best solution in the long term because you don't want to constantly be running. But at the same time, you can be doing that while challenging and breaking down the systems that are oppressing the ability to organize and, do the representation that you want. So I firmly believe it's kind of a both and, kind of fight the system and work around it at the same time. And I think both of those things are going to be really useful.
Yeah, definitely. I guess to maybe follow up a little bit, I think our strategy in the past few years has really been to try to find ways to build structural power and I guess have a seat at those decision-making tables, right? So looking at a campus example, there's some schools that have student representatives on their, say, board, their highest governing bodies essentially, right, who take part in the decision-making. So, most of the time it's not really proportionate to the students, the number of students or the amount of stakeholders that they have. But yeah, in many ways it's, I guess, very important that we try to be a part of the system because, yeah, obviously the protests are very important, but at the end of the day, when we're always outside the system, students are getting killed around the world, right? So since we're IAPSS, with our global reach, we can definitely see that this sort of always outside the box looking in approach not only can be challenging in a sense that, yeah, we're not going to rebuild society and our image, but it's risky to the individual students involved, right? We had a situation, I guess, in Belarus, for instance, where one of our team members had to leave the country because it was getting too bad in terms of political persecution and other similar situations in Venezuela and stuff. So that kind of organizing has been, definitely very challenging. But
yeah, I mean, I can imagine. And so when I say work around the system, I'm not always talking about protesting and marches and things that put people at risk. I'm talking about intellectually working around the system too, about finding clever ways to get in through back doors, to find ways to rebuild things, to get legitimacy and be able to get your structural power back, but not necessarily by fighting that, hey, I want this position back or the seat back in the very traditional ways. So there's certainly other ways to do that. I don't know, in this context, what that looks like. But I think the idea is that there are a lot of solutions. And from a leadership perspective is being open to the fact that there are solutions you may not even realize that are out there. And they might not be a one size fits all. Something that works in one country might not work in another. And that's probably one of the most important things to remember. But that's the best part about thinking about identifying kind of what is the system. Of course, you want to, like I said, kind of challenge it and fight it and trying to be a part of it because of the power that it has. But at the same time, there's other power you can do around the system. Just sheer numbers of people who don't do things. I mean, you think about it, that, even just the most basic example is, You know, the university might have like a committee on dining services, and they're deciding on which restaurants to have on campus, and they don't have any student representation on it. Well, guess what? When they decide the restaurants don't eat at it, you know, I mean, there are things that you can do to bring power back and say, well, you want us to eat at your restaurants, and we have to have a voice at the table. And it's not just boycotting, but it's just trying to be kind of clever. And so when we talk about student leadership, we're talking about not just kind of trying to play the old game with the old rules. You all get a chance to create a new game. And inherently, you have a very big block of power that, while it doesn't feel like it, the older you get, the more power you get, because just sheer numbers. And you're bringing that mentality with you as you continue to get older.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of piece of advice to also think about as we approach global student governance here at IAPSS, but also help our like partners rebuild the associations that Justin was talking about like making sure that a system that has historically tried to work against the organizing potential of students can also be, to a certain extent, leveraged to help those very students that it seeks to kind of restrict. So finding the kind of, I don't want to say loopholes, but the missing links within a system that can be used that we can slip through to make sure that our voices are heard, to make sure that like in the next few years, we don't even have to worry about the loopholes at the end of the day and can do it in a much more streamlined fashion. I think that's a very good piece of advice to think about as we approach kind of our mandate this upcoming year. You know, just thinking about how we're going to organize in different regions as well. So I think that's an awesome piece of advice for both Justin and I and other global student leaders who are listening on to kind of take away.
Yeah, and as another, perhaps a closing point, in terms of research in the future about student leadership, I guess we also, from our practical perspective, see definitely a need for more research about kind of student leadership from maybe a real politics or political history kind of perspective, right? So for instance, we've mentioned a number of student organizations in our call here, but yeah, we'd really like to see a lot more coverage in terms of the history of these organizations and the student leaders that made them up, right? Because it's very difficult sometimes to find out what happened in the past and build on that knowledge. We've definitely had to go through quite some investigations to get that information, but that might, you know, help legitimize student leadership a bit more in academic discourse, which can then be disseminated slowly into the public realm, at least we hope. But I know there's some recent literature that's been coming out in terms of student leaders and kind of them reflecting on their careers in activism and social movements or in student governments, which has definitely been really helpful. But yeah, we definitely appreciate your time with us. And if you have maybe anything else that you would like to share, maybe it's a response to what Siddharth and I were just outlining, or in addition to a message to political science students around the world, then the floor is yours.
Well, I just want to say thanks for having me on here. I mean, you all are taking on a very large global task right now, you know, particularly with the, you know, both kind of a larger global political climate, but also national political climates that are just coming and trickling back even onto college campuses. And so you definitely have you know, your work cut out for you. But I guess the biggest thing I would say, and I've kind of said this all along, is really diversifying all of the approaches that you take to engage in leadership. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Really, this idea is that leadership happens when groups of people come together with various ideas and various approaches, and embracing that there's more than one right answer to the kinds of to the mandate that you have, and really exploring what are those different pieces. And I think that's going to serve you all well as you move forward.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time with us. And for all the political science students watching who might have made it to the end of this video, we definitely thank you for tuning in from around the world. And we definitely encourage you to subscribe if you haven't to our platforms, or get involved in the International Association for Political Science Students. And with that, take care and have a great rest of your day.